Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, US and Russian officials hold 4 hours of talks in Saudi Arabia. Talks aimed at mapping out negotiations on ending the conflict in Ukraine and improving relations between Moscow and Washington. Well, after those talks, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio called the dialogue a first step of what he called a long and difficult journey towards ending the war in Ukraine. But Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenzkyy says he won't recognize any eventual deal without his country's involvement. And the EU chief, Ursula von der Leyen, tells the visiting US envoy Keith Kellogg that Europe wants to work with Washington for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Well, Kellogg will visit Ukraine on Wednesday. Hello and welcome to the program. We begin with the talks that were held today in Saudi Arabia between senior officials from Russia and the United States. Well, these talks are seen as a prelude to negotiations aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. However, Ukraine was not present at the talks. Well, the US delegation included the Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Donald Trump's National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. Well, on the Russian side, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Russia's Chief Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Ushakov. Well, the talks were hosted by the Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud and the Saudi National Security Advisor Mossad bin Mohammed Al Ayban. Well, it's hoped that these talks will pave the way for an eventual summit between President Putin and President Trump. But the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, says that a meeting between the US and Russian presidents could take several months. And were a meeting to occur, it would likely take place in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, he added. Well, ahead of the talks, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, said that, quote, good US-Russia relations are very important for the whole world.
I think the discussion today with the US team are very important, and we've been consistently saying that good US-Russia relations are very important for the whole world. Only jointly can Russia and US address lots of world problems, resolve global conflicts, and offer solutions.
Well, as those high-stakes talks between the US and Russia took place in Saudi Arabia earlier on today, let's get a quick reminder of some of the sticking points in any potential peace deal for the war in Ukraine. Ukraine insists that no deal can be reached without its presence. The country also demands the full withdrawal of Russian troops from areas seized during the war. Meanwhile, the Kremlin says that the Russian President Vladimir Putin has stated that he has no objection to Ukraine joining the EU, but NATO membership would be a red line. Well, President Putin has also indicated that he is ready to negotiate the matter with President Zelenskyy if necessary. Well, speaking from Riyadh, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that NATO membership for Ukraine was indeed unacceptable, as was the appearance of NATO member troops, even if they operated under a different flag. Well, for his part, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that Russia and the US have agreed to restaff their respective embassies in Washington and Moscow and appoint high-level teams to continue negotiations.
We're going to appoint our teams, respectively, that have worked very quickly to reestablish the functionality of our respective missions in Washington and in Moscow. For us to be able to continue to move down this road, we need to have diplomatic facilities that are operating and functioning normally. The point is that we're going to appoint a high-level team from our end to help negotiate and work through the end of the conflict in Ukraine in a way that's enduring and acceptable to all the parties engaged. And the last thing we agreed to is that while our teams are going to be working on all of this, the four of us who were here today, the five of us that were here today, are going to remain engaged in this process to make sure that it's moving along in a productive way.
Well, for more on the Russian perspective, we can speak now to Sergei Markov, who is a former spokesperson to President Vladimir Putin, who joins us now from Moscow. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Markov.
Thank you.
4 hours of talks. What was achieved, in your opinion?
Mostly important what this main part of the team, international foreign policy team of Trump and Putin made, it was a discussion about more key problems and issues. And they decided on which point they agree, on which point they disagree. They didn't inform us about this, but it was very, very important for the resolving of such problems. So its main results. Additionally, they come to the idea that embassies should start working fully. By American initiatives during more than 10 years, it started even from Obama presidency, the diplomat corps in both countries decreasing. And now it's almost, in 10 or 20 times less than it was before the crisis 10 years ago. Now, this will be amount of diplomats will be recovered fully. It means the number of diplomats will be increased in 20 times. It means that diplomacy will be open. The door for diplomacy will be open. But because we know that the main problem now, Ukrainian problem, but to come from the war to the peace, you need diplomatic relationship. If you have not ambassadors, no diplomacy, you cannot find a diplomatic solution. So it's absolutely inevitable step what they made now. It's first step, but it opens the door for the negotiation about resolving Ukrainian crisis, which is very good and supported by absolutely most in the world, except war maniac Zelenskyy, and except some European leaders who also sometimes look like war maniacs, like Macron and leaders of the Germany and Great Britain, which has replaced each other so quickly that nobody already remembers their names.
Obviously, your foreign minister called this a very useful conversation. We heard from Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, calling this a new logic, saying that the dialogue was very constructive. What are your observations about what happens next? What's your understanding of what we've now paved the way for?
On the practical level, I think the working group will be formed of most of the discussed issues. And they will recover diplomats. They will claim Russian ambassador, because before this, Biden administration blocked opportunity for Russia to have ambassador in Washington. So they will create again diplomatic systems. It's the main first will be next. And after this, diplomatic team will start the negotiation on different issues. By the way, the main problem is not the Ukrainian problem. The main problem is the problem of the possible nuclear war between Russia and United States, because United States army, because of order of President Joe Biden, previous President Joe Biden, they in fact take part in the war in Kursk region by attacking by ATACMS rocket missiles. It's number one priority to save from all the world from the nuclear catastrophe. It's very, very important. But on the Ukrainian crisis also, the working group should be created, and Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will claim specific names who will be from both sides to work on the resolving condition, finding condition for the resolving of the Ukrainian crisis.
Okay, Mr. Markov, so Marco Rubio, the brand new US Secretary of State, said he's convinced that Russia is willing to engage to end the war in Ukraine. Let me ask you this. Russia controls about 20% of Ukrainian territory. Do you see Russia relinquishing control of the 20% that it controls as one of the conditions for bringing about peace in Ukraine?
Forget about territories at all. Russia doesn't interesting about territories. Russia is the biggest country in the world. What Russia has to do, we cannot move those people who live in those territories to the hands of the clear terroristic regime which have been created by Western countries in Ukraine. To protect our people is most important. The main issue, not territory, the main issue is the character of Ukrainian regime. Because the reason of why Russia has to start this military operation is to protect also members of citizens of Ukraine from the repressive, neo-Nazi, terroristic, illegal regime which we have in Ukraine right now. So, and by the way, this is security guarantee for Ukraine. We understand that security should be for sure for Ukraine, but security guarantee, not militarization, not NATO troops, but coming back to democracy of Ukraine, coming back to democracy which been in Ukraine between 1991, of calling independence, and 2014. Ukraine was in absolute security those times. So we should back by character of Ukrainian regime to the situation before the coup of 2014, which has come to this catastrophe. It's very simple. It's main Russian demands.
Okay, clearly there's going to be a lot to talk about if and when President Trump and President Vladimir Putin hold talks. I want to ask you something else. Under President Biden, the Kremlin described relations with Washington as being, quote, below zero. Where are they now?
These relations now above the zero, because we didn't resolve any problems. Americans still stolen, many Russian monies, so as Europeans. We still have repressive neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine. We still continue the war. We still great sanctions against Russia. We still all have all those problems. But now we have at least some kind of political will from Donald Trump to come to the peace and to come to the compromise. It's like you have conflict with your neighbor. You have fighting with your neighbor. But one moment you decided you should say hello to your neighbor. It's not solution to the problem, no. But it's first inevitable step to solution of war. Russia and United States, first time after 10 years, they say to each other, hello. It's very good.
Sure, and just to pick up on that, I mean, if using the Kremlin's same scale, with below zero being the state of relations under President Biden, are they now above zero? What number are you giving them?
Yes, they're about zero. Some a little bit above zero. Some a little bit in small plus up of the zero.
How confident are you that dialogue and this newfound dialogue between the two sides are going to deliver peace?
Nobody could be sure about this. First of all, we have a tremendous international crisis, which we didn't expect a few years ago. And we have the world changing so quickly and so unpredictable style, which difficult also make some kind of confusion about future. We have Donald Trump, who is not the most predictable politician in the world. So it's difficult for analysts to predict. My just guess that possibility for the peace deal in Ukraine on the spring, 20%. The possibility of the peace deal about Ukrainian crisis to the end of this year, 65%.
Okay, that sounds quite optimistic. So you're expecting results during the course of this year, and you're not expecting the talks to collapse. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. I think from Donald Trump point of view, this conflict should be stopped with Russia, because this conflict moved Russia, first of all, Russian economy to the Chinese economy, which is regarded by Donald Trump, as you know, as main strategic competitor to the United States. Secondly, United States spent so many money to Ukrainian crisis. And didn't spend this money to its southern border. Additionally to this, Vladimir Zelenskyy and his team regarded as enemies of Donald Trump because they worked for the enemies of Donald Trump inside American politics many years. Additionally to this, what kind of victory United States can have from Ukrainian war? No any perspective for any victory. Also, if you look at the European leaders who support Ukrainian war, all of them political enemies of Donald Trump. Why he should be with his enemies? So very reasonable for Donald Trump to move to the stopping this Ukrainian war and to accept Russian conditions. Not because Russia is winner, but because Russian condition is very minimum and very realistic. Do you want I can say you about Russian big maximum condition to say you? You want me to say?
Yes.
It's very simple. Most of the Ukrainian territory should be part of the Russia, except Lvov and some small part of the western Ukraine. It's first. Secondly, all European leaders should be arrested and go to the prison and to the international, like Nuremberg Tribunal, because all of them know that they supported absolutely clear terroristic regime in Ukraine. It's Russian maximum demands. But Russia understands that these demands probably not so much realistic.
Okay, I'm not sure that those demands are going to be met, but maybe I'm wrong. One thing we heard from the Kremlin today, though, the president of Russia is, quote, prepared to talk to President Zelenskyy of Ukraine if necessary, they said, if necessary being the key words. In your opinion, is it necessary that those two men talk, and do you think that's likely to happen?
I don't think personally that there's some necessity to work with Vladimir Zelenskyy. Vladimir Zelenskyy, he is a drug-dependent person, and he is maniac of the war, and he is war criminal, and he is not represent now majority of the Ukrainians, because Ukrainians want peace and Zelenskyy want war. So what reason to negotiate with him? Ukraine also doesn't exist as an independent country because Ukraine too much depend on the big Western coalition. And so no reason to, from my point of view, to have Zelenskyy as part of the negotiation. Most of the Ukrainian politicians will be happy if Zelenskyy will be kicked out, because most of the Ukrainian, except few groups of the neo-Nazis, most of the Ukrainians want the peace as soon as possible. And they absolutely don't care about Donbass, Crimea, and so on. The Ukrainians, they even ready to give Russia Odessa and Kharkov to get the peace as soon as possible.
But if a Ukrainian person was here, they would say, we didn't invade our own country. It was invaded by Russia. They didn't want war. That's what they would say. They would say, you invaded, your country invaded their country. They clearly don't want war.
Russian invasion was humanitarian operation to save Ukraine from a neo-Nazi regime. If you invited those Ukrainians who represent neo-Nazi regime, of course, they will talk what you now told me about. But you, in your media, invited all these 10 years only neo-Nazi Ukrainians. But I personally know a lot of Ukrainians who will say you absolutely on contrary than you was told now. And if you go, if you send your journalists and ask ordinary people, they will say you secretly because they afraid terrorist machine of Zelenskyy. But they will say you secretly, we want to have peace as soon as possible, because half of the millions of Ukrainians already have been killed in those wars for reasons which we don't know, which we don't understand. You may know that Odessa and Kharkov, they're Russian cities. They 90% of the people who speak, they speak Russian language. They've been part of the Russia during 1,000 years. So what is the reason to fight for Russian cities?
Just lastly, as we look forward to what happens next and possibly these talks face-to-face between the Russian and American presidents. Obviously, trust is earned. Not many European leaders trust President Putin. But do you think President Putin trusts President Trump?
I think that President Putin trusts President Trump more than to other American politicians. Generally, I would say Russian society, Russian public, Russian elite doesn't trust Americans at all because we have so many agreements with Americans which have been violated. But I think Putin understands that Trump is another kind of politician compared with normal American politician which he made last years. And Donald Trump, he's populist. He represents not deep state of United States. Donald Trump represents these average Americans. And these average Americans, they demand Donald Trump, you should make the peace deal with Russia. And the main enemies of Vladimir Putin is same as main enemies for Donald Trump. It's deep state of United States of America, and this is European, so-called global liberals, something like this. Euro-bureaucracy.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Sergei Markov, former spokesperson for Vladimir Putin. Thank you very much indeed. Well, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Ola Stefanie commented on that matter on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference, where European Union foreign ministers also held another emergency meeting during the course of the weekend. That followed on from US statements which said that Europe will not be included in the upcoming peace talks between the US, Russia and Ukraine.
Ukrainian delegation has been invited to participate in the meetings of the ministers of the European affairs under the Polish presidency. President Zelenskyy had a long phone call with President Macron after the urgent meeting of the leaders yesterday. So they have discussed all the range of issues on the table. I'm happy to confirm that it is an active discussion within the European Union on European troops on the ground, on guaranteeing the security for Ukraine, and we are closely following the developments at the U.S. side, but I'm sure that European Union, while being hesitant on many issues, still will be strong enough to help Ukraine prevail.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Dr. Stefanie Babst, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us, Dr. Babst. These talks in Riyadh have been described as exploratory talks, not the start of full-blown negotiations to ending the war in Ukraine. And as much as anything, they were about resetting relations between Moscow and Washington. So very much a first step. But do you think this was a constructive step?
Certainly not. Here is the Trump administration, as you rightly pointed out, seeking to reset broader relations with a pariah, with somebody who has attacked and is still attacking another country, with somebody who is warranted with as a war criminal, somebody who has proven to be one of the most aggressive actors on the European continent and beyond. So, no, the US has unfortunately left the broader Western democratic consensus to contain Russia, to punish Russia for its behavior. And it also, it's obvious that it rather seeks to reward Russia. And that is really a tragedy.
So you're saying these talks shouldn't have taken place at all. Some in the Trump administration would argue that bringing President Putin in from the cold makes the world a safer place. What do you say to that argument?
Well, I'd say this is pretty much rubbish. I mean, we have a Russian president who has not demonstrated any indications, any willingness to reconsider his broader strategic objectives. He is still on the war path, with Ukraine. As we speak, his troops are destroying Ukrainian cities and firing drones and missiles. He has upgraded in the past 3 years his military posture along all military domains that he has put in place in order to threaten Europe. He has increased his hybrid irregular war activities against NATO and EU member countries. And he has stated on various occasions that he wants to alter the strategic balance of power, weaken and paralyze NATO and EU countries, and expand his own sphere of influence. So here is somebody who has a very clear strategic objective, and he will certainly like to use the so-called negotiation in Riyadh to get a rehabilitation from President Trump on the world stage, something which he long sought to do, but former US President Biden rejected this. And he will push the American team in order to ease or even lift economic sanctions. And at the same time, everything that will currently be discussed will put him in the limelight back on the international stage. So yes, he has a lot of gains to make, and he, I think, thinks that he is certainly on the path to victory.
You, of course, know Russia extremely well. You have a PhD in Russian studies, and you know the European and regional geopolitical landscape extremely well as well. Is this a case, in your opinion, of a brand new administration simply being naive, or do you think there's more to it than that?
No, this is not about naivety. I have, as you know, spent most of my professional time at NATO headquarters. I sat through numerous, probably hundreds meetings of the NATO-Russia Council. I even chaired a number of NATO-Russia Council meetings. So I know really what Russians are up to. And in fact, we've had now some 11 years, which is the time since Russia illegally annexed Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine to come to grips with an aggressive Russian regime. And unfortunately, Europeans and also the Trump administration pursued a policy of we must not provoke Russia. They were clearly not willing to really robustly contain Russia. And President Trump, already in his first presidency, used very close financial, personal, and other ties to the Kremlin, who has influenced the election campaign during the first presidency of President Trump and has repeated that. No, there is a network, a very close network between the Trump administration and its associate and the Kremlin and its associates. So here are two clan chiefs meeting each other and try to come into business like we've been in the 19th or early 20th century. So I think this is really pretty upsetting.
So what do you think it is that's motivating President Donald Trump here?
Well, President Trump and his Make America First agenda is clearly geared towards recoupling from Europe. I think he sees himself par to par with the big players in Moscow and in Beijing. He certainly has no interest to really keep the traditional alliances and partnerships that the United States has built over the past 70 plus years. He wants to, I think, use the relationships that he is about to reset with President Putin in order to make gains, profitable economic, financial, personal gains, but also to establish the United States as an actor with, or rather a country, a global power, with whom people must reckon, but not in a predictable way. He uses on purpose this shock and awe disruptive strategy, makes everybody guessing, puts everybody under time pressure, threatens allies left and right hand. So this, I think, is all part of his strategy.
And just judging from one of the tweets you've put out in the last couple of days, you've said this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about President Trump trying to, quote, decouple the Russian-Chinese no-limit partnership. What was the thinking behind that? Help us understand that.
Well, the Trump administration, as the previous administration, have on numerous occasions made clear that their strategic focus is the strategic competition primarily in the field of economy and technology with China. And they are, I think, right in terms of looking at China as an actor who is equally interested, like Russia, to alter the broader international architecture and to break the rules-based system that we have built ever since the end of the Second World War. By putting Putin basically on his side, by trying to side with them, to partner with them again, I think Trump hopes, that the Chinese would have to split their energies between, on the one hand side, Washington, and on the other hand side, Moscow. Whether that gameplay will yield some results, some beneficial results for the United States is yet to be seen, because we are really very early in the stage. But the no-limit partnership between Moscow and Beijing has empowered Russia to do what it has done in the past 3+ years in Europe, and in particular vis-à-vis Ukraine. Without Chinese support, military, economic, financial, and other support, the Chinese war machinery would not be as productive and as powerful as it is. So I think there is a broader power play here in the mind of President Putin. And from his perspective, Europeans, as well as other traditional partners of the United States in Asia and in the Middle East, they're, let's say, in the second or third tier. They don't really count as they used to count from his perspective. So that's really a fundamental shift in U.S. Global posture and in U.S. global foreign policy.
We've heard from the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, saying that he was talking about the meeting that was held in Paris, that everyone's aware that transatlantic relations, the NATO alliance, and our friendship with the United States have entered a new phase. I want to pick up on what you said there, a new phase, and ask you for your thoughts. Do you still consider the United States to be an ally of Europe?
I perfectly understand that European governments, for instance, the Polish government, have really a hard time to reconsider the image that they have created about President Trump. They think they can still manage him, tame him, influence him, impress him. But my personal view is that it's not going to work. President Putin will likely take the gains he can make from these bilateral partnerships he has with Poland or with Sweden or with many other European countries in the field of defense and defense industrial security related issues, and he will pocket them, and then he will move on. If he was really a reliable ally, still committed to NATO, he wouldn't have done what he has done, namely to decouple from Europe and put himself on a path to embrace President Putin again. So I certainly have I have really doubts, strong doubts about the reliability of the United States. But this is not to say, that the allies will not try, to work at least punctually and partially on other issues with the United States.
But do you think the United States can still be counted as an ally?
I know you're pressing me for that. I have made up my mind already. I don't think, unless, they would reconsider what they have embarked on. They would consider their policy. I personally don't think they can be considered the traditional ally that we have come to appreciate and we have known for the past 75 years. This is a different administration. They're on a different path, on a different planet.
Yeah, and you've been quoted as saying that you think that President Trump has switched sides. What do you mean by that?
Well, as I already said, if you call an aggressor a war criminal, somebody who has over the past 11 years fundamentally threatened Europe, somebody who is on the path to destroy a country, somebody who has committed countless war crimes. If you call him and say, I don't want to talk about all these things, and I certainly don't seek to hold you accountable. I simply want to figure out where we can get back into business. I would call this a fundamental policy shift. So he has left, the United States has left the strategic consensus that it has built over, the past decades with European countries to uphold the rules-based order. Yeah, you can't, preach about rules and then at the same time you put them into the bin. And this is what President Putin has done. He has violated numerous norms and regulations and rules, basic rules that have governed our international system ever since the end of the Second World War. And President Putin is now ready to side with him in order to explore how he can, embark on a broader reset between US and the US and Russia. So that's, again, I'm making the same point. That's really something fundamental. It's not just an irritant in the transatlantic relationship. This is not just a minor little something. This is really a seismic shift.
Okay, and just lastly, what's Europe going to do about all of this then?
Well, Europe has wasted 3+ years in order to avoid answering a question that, from my perspective, is the most important question. What is it that we Europeans seek what is it that we, describe as our strategic end state? What is our strategic objective vis-a-vis Russia and for Ukraine? Do we want to really help Ukraine win the war against Russia? Do we want to see victory over Russia, or are we prepared to, accept some type of frozen war in the middle of Europe? And if you don't answer that question clearly, you can't possibly prescribe a strategy and use, the functions and the tools that you have in order to contain the aggressor. And the Europeans have hidden behind President Joe Biden's agenda of we must not provoke Russia for the past 3 years. And I really take them responsible, at least partly, for creating this deplorable situation in which Ukraine finds itself in. So to cut a long story short, the Europeans need to do now at least 2 things in parallel. They need to rigorously upgrade and bolster their own defense and deterrence capabilities, their own. And secondly, they must ensure that Ukraine is not thrown under the Russian bus. And this means we will have to continue providing military aid in a much more systematic, much more focused, much more, holistic and strengthened way than we did in the past 3 years. And we need to really side with Ukraine and its own ambition. President Zelenskyy has made a proposal for a victory plan. He has made various proposals of how he sees the future of Ukraine. And I think it's our job to support that.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Stefanie Babst. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, while the EU insists on being at the negotiation table when discussing Ukraine, President Trump's special envoy, Keith Kellogg, stated at a global security conference in Munich last Saturday that the US would act as an intermediary in the talks, with Ukraine and Russia as the 2 primary parties. Well, when asked about the prospects of European involvement, Kellogg bluntly stated that he did not believe it was likely to happen.
So the Europeans, who have provided as much or more support than the Americans in this process, you don't think should be at the table directly. You think it should be 2 protagonists.
I said I'm a school of realism. I think that's not going to happen. But I said that's one of the reasons I'm here talking to people. One of the reasons we're going out, we're doing it, to making sure that their positions are well known, that when we go into these positions, they're well stated. Now, that may be great, like fingers on a chalkboard. That may grate a little bit, but I'm telling you something that's really quite honest. So if you, part of the problem that we looked at when you looked at Minsk too, there was a lot of people at the table that really had no ability to execute some type of peace process, and it failed miserably. So we're not going to go down that path.
Well, despite his earlier statements, Kellogg travelled to Brussels earlier on today to meet with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Well, von der Leyen told President Donald Trump's envoy that Europe is eager to collaborate with the US in talks aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Matthew Bryza, former US ambassador to Azerbaijan and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. Great to have you with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Just wanted to start by asking you for your take on the overall US approach to this newly begun dialogue with Russia.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for having me back. It's great to be with you. At face value, the approach of the United States is tectonically different from anything in the past. And as you and I have discussed before, I was raised as a Cold Warrior. For us, we would never imagine any negotiations about a country at war without that country being at the table. And we'd certainly never imagine a negotiation about a conflict in Europe without our European allies. So at first blush, it's a shocking approach that would appear to play right into Russia's hands of dividing the United States from its European allies. Now, the Trump administration will resoundingly disagree with what I just said. What they'll say is that this is the first discussion with Putin. They're trying to, or not with Putin, but with Russia, trying to set up a meeting between Putin and Trump and trying to coax the Russians to the table at a moment when Putin seems intent on continuing the war. He's got his economy completely on a war footing. He feels he's starting to generate offensive momentum. And he believes that if the Trump administration behaves the way Trump, the candidate, did, time is on Russia's side because the United States will cut support to Ukraine. So if Trump is correct that he's just trying to coax Putin to the table when Putin thinks he's winning, this might be a good approach. But it's a radical departure from all that the U.S. has tried since the end of World War II, which is to maintain solidarity with its European allies.
Okay, but as you're saying, the Trump administration and, in fact, some in the Russian delegation have dressed these talks up as being a bit different from what we had initially thought they were all about. They've said it's all about addressing the irritants to the US-Russian relationship. I mean, what are they getting at here? What irritants are they talking about? I mean, presumably Ukraine is one of them.
Yeah, of course it's one of them. I mean, President Putin himself literally wrote the book, or at least the monograph on the topic, when he said, essentially, that Ukraine has no reason to exist as an independent country. It's false. There's not a Ukrainian language. Ukraine is really just Russia, or Little Russia. So what Russia is getting at in terms of the irritants beyond Ukraine is something that's been on their proposal since 2008, when then President Dmitry Medvedev said there needs to be a new European architecture of security based on the concept of equal security, meaning that no country or no member of the transatlantic space or the Euro-Atlantic community can take any action that would be perceived as threatening the security of any other European country, which of course includes military political alliances or any sort of collaboration between some Europeans and or Americans that in this case Russia would not like. Putin made that request or demand more specific in the lead up to his invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and he said that Russia or NATO must withdraw all of its forces that were deployed after Russia invaded Donbass and Crimea, and must even reduce its overall commitment to the Eastern European members of NATO, which is an absolute non-starter for those members of NATO who feel that throughout their history they've been threatened by an aggressive Russia.
Okay, so obviously a lot of European leaders are pretty stunned by what's been happening. They feel excluded. That's why the special representative to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, has been traveling around Europe trying to appease them. But I mean, if this was about Russia and the United States patching up their relationship, why do European leaders think they should have been at the table?
Right. So I think that's because European leaders do not believe this is about Russia and the United States patching up their relationship. On the contrary, European leaders believe President Trump is pursuing the proverbial strategic condominium of a special separate deal with Russia over the heads or behind the backs of A, Ukraine, and B, the European members of NATO, many of whom are frontline states in this conflict. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think that the European leaders think Trump is either being naive and being manipulated by Putin, or by design wants to cut a separate deal and a separate peace with Russia, regardless of the interests of the European leaders and European countries.
Okay, so we also heard from Keith Kellogg that he's working on what he called Trump time. Basically, things have to happen quickly, and some people will tell you that's a grave error when it comes to negotiating. You shouldn't be in a hurry to negotiate anything. You should be willing to walk away from the table. But perhaps Washington, the Trump administration would argue this wasn't a negotiation. These were the talks before the negotiation. So, it doesn't matter what speed we do things at, does it?
I strongly agree. Yes, and I as critical as I just was of the fundamental nature of this approach, Trump's approach to the peace negotiations with Ukraine, it's refreshing, on the other hand, to have a sense of urgency. And and as Keith Kellogg said, to have to move on Trump time, which means immediately, to get something going. I also think another thing that Kellogg said is quite useful. He said, look, Europe just wants a seat at the table, but they're not saying what they're going to bring to the table. They need to make commitments in terms of materiel, military materiel, and maybe personnel on the ground, and even greater financial support for Ukraine. In other words, Ukraine is Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a threat to European security, so the Europeans need to do more for their own security. And that's a legitimate argument. But when it comes to the actual negotiations of a peace treaty, having negotiated, peace treaties or agreements in several armed conflicts in Europe, I think they shouldn't be rushed. But we're not, as Kellogg said, and as you said, Tom, we're not in the actual negotiations yet. We're just getting to the stage when the negotiations can occur. And as senior representatives of the Trump administration said yesterday, when the time comes, of course, Ukraine will be at the table.
Exactly. So these are the negotiations before the negotiations. Yeah. When the negotiations do begin for real, your understanding is that Ukraine will most certainly be involved.
Well, that's what some members of the Trump administration claimed yesterday. I think there's disarray now in the Trump foreign policy apparatus because so many of the senior positions are unfilled. The National Security Council staff, where I worked for 4 years under President George W. Bush, it is the place where ideas are vented, are then compared with the president's overall agenda. And it's the National Security Council staff that has to make sure each agency that has an interest in any issue gets a fair hearing. And the National Security Council staff right now is terribly understaffed. So those sorts of debates, policy debates between and among the various elements of the U.S. government are not happening. So we're getting disarray in many cases.
How do you rate the chances of bringing about some sort of an agreement between the two sides and therefore ending the war in Ukraine? I mean, what sort of a time frame do you think we're looking at?
I actually don't think it's possible under certain circumstances on the ground militarily. I think there's no chance President Putin's going to agree to a peace until he's expelled all the Ukrainian troops from Russia's Kursk region or Kursk Oblast. And as long as Putin feels he's got the military momentum and is gaining pieces of Ukrainian territory, albeit slowly with enormous human and economic cost, he'll keep going. He's got his economy on a war footing. And as long as he believes U.S. President Trump wants to get peace almost at any cost and is willing to stop providing military support for Ukraine, Putin will feel he has momentum. But I think that Trump is committed to sustaining the support to Ukraine and then putting a lot of pressure on Putin in terms of more sanctions to try to break the Russian economy if Putin shows that what I said is correct, that Putin is not willing yet to negotiate in good faith as long as he feels the momentum is in his favor on the battlefield. I hope I'm wrong, but I think I'm right. And so I think we're going to see this round of talks fail, never get off the ground. And then I think we'll see Trump putting more pressure on Putin. And then we'll see whether or not real talks will begin in earnest.
And then we might as well see, perhaps, an improving in relations between Washington and Europe, because the Europeans are extremely concerned. They feel it's almost as though we were talking to a guest just a moment ago, suggesting that perhaps Donald Trump had switched sides. It
feels that way. Based on what we were talking about at the beginning of our chat, what Trump is doing in excluding our closest allies marks a tectonic, and from the perspective of anybody who's thought about international security in NATO for the last 50, 60, 70 years, a shift for the negative. So it's understandable that they, the Europeans, who have the most to lose after Ukraine, if Russia continues its war, by the way, I believe likely on NATO territory in the Baltic states or Poland, if there's insufficient cost for invading and occupying Ukraine, they're of course the ones that are the most upset. And even Turkey, whereas President Zelenskyy is visiting today, is saying, and Zelensky's agreed, not only must Ukraine be at the table, but Turkey should be at the negotiating table too, as a NATO ally.
Yeah, it seems like everyone wants to be at the negotiating table. And I mean, the thing with regards to NATO, though, I mean, President Trump made it clear before any dialogue got started that was out of the question, Ukraine's eventual membership of NATO. I mean, what can the United States offer to Ukraine by way of security assurances if they're not going to be part of NATO?
Well, first of all, yeah, President Trump's expressed view was just what you said. Ukraine should not become a member of NATO, but the United States should, with its allies, arm Ukraine sufficiently to deter any future Russian aggression. And then Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth said something similar last week. But there are Republican members of the U.S. Senate who say, hang on, we can't say Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. It's still official NATO policy based on the NATO summit decision in April 2008 in Bucharest, that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO when they fulfill the criteria. So Trump and his Secretary of Defense can articulate whatever they want about today's situation, but there will be new presidents, and NATO's door is officially open to Ukrainian membership. But what else can the U.S. offer? It can offer troops on the ground. Trump has said not U.S. ones, but European allies, troops on the ground, not under a NATO umbrella. So in other words, a credible security guarantee. The United States can also will offer in general backstopping then of that security guarantee, meaning all kinds of other military political support for the Europeans who would put their troops on the ground. The U.S. can offer also investment and financial support. But unfortunately, what seems to have been proposed to Ukraine last week by the Trump administration was a deal whereby the United States would be compensated for all the support it's provided Ukraine in the past and will provide in the future by gaining control or ownership of 50% of Ukraine's critical minerals, like lithium and cobalt, and then 50% of the revenues of the remaining half of those resources that others would end up owning and developing. When you look at the financial cost of such a deal, the terms are actually financially more onerous than those that were imposed on post-imperial Germany in the Versailles Treaty after World War I, which, as we know, helped lay the foundation for the rise of the Nazis because those terms were so financially onerous and destroyed the German economy.
Yeah, the Russians came up with a new demand today before the talks got started. They said they weren't just happy with what President Trump had said about NATO membership for Ukraine. They demanded that NATO formally disavow membership. That was a promise it made to Ukraine in 2008. I mean,
yeah.
What do you read into that? Russia demanding a concession before the talks have even started, and in fact, I'm not sure that Russia's made any concessions of its own, has it?
Oh, on the contrary, it not only has it made no concessions, it has pocketed ones that it believes the U.S. has offered, like the one you're talking about. And then up the ante. It also, I heard the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, Kirill Dmitriev, just now on a TV interview, doing the same thing when it comes to sanctions relief. I know from my business life now, here in Istanbul, consulting business, that the Russian government is 100% sending out feelers through some of its companies about what it will look like or what it would look like if there was peace and the United States were to unwind the sanctions. 100% Russia really wants that to happen. Yet the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund said today, no, we're not interested in lifting the sanctions. That doesn't matter to us. We're just worried about these NATO issues. Well, that's a lie. It's upping the ante. They're pocketing a concession and then trying to get more. And then they're also simultaneously trying to build a split between the United States and other NATO members by sowing discord in the alliance and frightening some NATO members, or playing on those like Viktor Orban, who want to say, yes, of course, we never should have enlarged NATO and we shouldn't go any further. Ukraine doesn't deserve to be a member. Whereas other NATO member states, like Poland, the Baltic states, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands, no, Ukraine should eventually join NATO. So it's upping the ante and pocketing concessions on the one hand by Russia, and then trying to sow discord within the NATO alliance on the other hand.
And all the while, and I think we were talking about this last week, we're seeing the United States, in many ways, shifting its focus away from Europe and more towards what it considers to be a more pressing issue, which is what's happening in the Asia-Pacific region, notably with regards to China. I mean, do you think that's part of why President Trump's administration seems to be keen on leaving Europe very much to its own devices?
Absolutely, yes, I do, and that goes back to the Obama administration when he wanted to pivot to Asia and then rebalance toward Asia. He said so. Yes, and there's another point. Steve Bannon was recently interviewed in the Greek newspaper Katamirini. It's an amazing interview when he says what Trump is trying to do is essentially create a fortress America. So he's looking at naval considerations. He wants to get a special relationship with Greenland to prevent Russia from having open access, its submarines, open access to the U.S. Atlantic coastline. Same with the Panama Canal. He doesn't want China and Russia to be able to move freely through the canal and threaten the United States from a naval perspective. Same with Canada to a certain perspective. And then Trump wants to create an Iron Dome, referencing the Israeli air defense system, over the United States to make the United States impenetrable by Russia and by China. So yes, there's that pivot toward Indo-Asian theater, but there's also this desire to protect the United States from any threats that China or Russia could instill, and make clear that Russia really cannot be a threat to the United States, and then let Europe take care of its own security, let it pay for its own security, and let the United States worry about itself. I think that's the overall approach by the Trump administration. I think it's a faulty one, to be honest.
How dangerous do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it is the objective now. I think it will fail. And I think if the Trump administration were in earnest to pursue that, I think it's only likely to aggravate the splits within NATO and between the United States and its other allies like Japan and South Korea, close friends like Mexico. I think ultimately that'll undermine U.S. security if the U.S. pursues that maximalist sort of isolationist or self-focused approach. But I don't think it'll work. I don't think the approach to, if Trump were trying to cut a special deal with with Russia about Ukraine, that'll work, because Ukraine will never accept it. And what the Ukrainian nation has showed us in the aftermath of World War I and the aftermath of World War II is Ukrainians will keep on fighting, regardless of what the great powers decide at the end of a war, if Ukrainians feel threatened.
So just turning our eye back as we wrap up to the talks today in Riyadh, I'm just wondering what you think of the fact that, we were talking about timing a bit earlier on. Let's also talk about experience, because on the one hand, you have this team of veteran negotiators on the Russian side, someone like Sergei Lavrov, who's been in his job for more than 20 years. And on the other side, you've got someone who's been in their job, Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, for not even a month. I mean, there's a real mismatch, wasn't there, in terms of experience. Do you think it would perhaps be better for the United States to have perhaps left this one for a little bit later in the administration, rather than trying to strike a deal now when everyone is still so new to their jobs?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've worked with extremely closely Foreign Minister Lavrov when we were working together, U.S., Russia, and France, in mediating the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And he's a brilliant negotiator and diplomat, as well as Yuri Ushakov, who was longtime Russian ambassador in Washington and is Putin's closest advisor on foreign policy. These are consummate professionals who think about diplomacy not like a real estate deal, as Middle East advisor Steve Witkoff, who's part of the Ukraine negotiating team, and is a great negotiator and deal maker when it comes to real estate, but doesn't think about the psychology and the intersection of individual psychology and national psychology, like Ushakov and like Lavrov do. Few diplomats in the world have that level of sophistication like those Russian diplomats. So I think the U.S. team is far outclassed. Mike Waltz is, he's a great member of Congress. He's a strategic thinker. But these collectively, I mean, those two Russian diplomats alone have, a half a century of highest level strategic negotiations. And they are extremely clever and skillful.
Okay, so clearly, as you're saying, a mismatch, a massive mismatch in the levels of experience between the two sides. Clearly, the Russians will have gone in there for, and this is my last question, knowing that they had the upper hand.
Oh, completely. That's why this is happening. They think that they are going to be able to flatter Trump, as is the Russian tactic. I've seen it in my own diplomatic and political life a million times. They tried it on me. They come to you like they'll come to Trump and say, you understand us. All those other hawks in Washington, they're unsophisticated, uncivilized. People like you, you're better. You understand us, and we can find common ground. That's why Putin has formed something called the Valdai Discussion Club. He takes people in Washington who believe that they understand Russia better than the hawks in Washington and are best suited to find peace. And Putin tells them exactly what they want to hear. That is what's going to happen now. It's going to be Lavrov and Ushakov saying to Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz and Steve Witkoff, thank God we're together with you. We got rid of those Biden war hawks, warmongers. We can find common ground with you. Help us create peace for the long term in Europe by having a whole new European security architecture in which NATO is no longer a driving force. Let's make peace between the United States and Russia for our grandchildren and the next generations. And usually Americans eat that stuff up, but they should be careful because they're being played.
Okay, well, it's been great talking to you. Really appreciate your analysis. Matthew Bryza, former US ambassador to Azerbaijan.
I loved it.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.